The transport ship Meridian's edge shuddered as it broke through Earth's atmosphere for what everyone aboard knew would be the last time. Captain Sarah Chen pressed her palm against the cold metal wall, feeling the vibrations travel through her bones. Below them, humanity's cradle grew smaller with each passing second, its blue marble surface now marred by the geometric scars of alien strip mining operations. 10,000 souls, whispered Dr. Marcus Webb from the observation deck beside her. His weathered hands gripped the rail until his knuckles turned white. 10,000 people, and we're supposed to be grateful. Sarah didn't respond immediately. The weight of command had never felt heavier than it did now, watching Earth disappear behind them. The Zephyrian overlords had been clear in their mandate: humanity would serve as a labor force across their expanding empire, and Earth would be harvested for its resources. The lucky few aboard the transport ships were destined for the agricultural worlds, while the rest of humanity would toil in the asteroid mines or the industrial complexes of distant moons. The Zephyrians had arrived 3 years ago, their massive dreadnoughts blotting out the sun over major cities worldwide. There had been no dramatic battle, no heroic last stand. Humanity's most advanced weapons barely scratched their energy shields, and their retaliation had been swift and decisive. Within 72 hours, every major military installation on Earth had been reduced to glass craters. The aliens themselves were an imposing sight, tall, angular beings with crystalline skin that shifted colors based on their emotions. Their technology seemed almost magical to human eyes, bending the laws of physics with casual ease. Most unsettling of all was their complete indifference to human suffering. To them, humans were simply another resource to be cataloged and utilized. Remember when we thought we were alone in the universe? Dr. Webb's voice carried a bitter laugh. Remember when our biggest worry was climate change? Sarah finally turned from the observation window. Around them, families huddled together on makeshift bedding, their few possessions clutched tightly in their arms. Children who should have been playing were instead learning to ration water and food. The elderly sat in stoic silence, having already lived through more than any generation should have to endure. We survived the ice ages, the plagues, 2 world wars, Sarah said quietly. We'll survive this too. Will we? Dr. Webb gestured toward a group of teenagers who were teaching younger children basic Zephyrian phrases. Look at them. They're adapting already. In a generation, maybe 2, will they even remember what it was like to be free? The question hung in the air like smoke. Sarah had asked herself the same thing countless times during the 3-month journey through space. The Zephyrians were efficient, she had to give them that. They provided adequate food, medical care, and living space. They didn't beat their human cargo or subject them to unnecessary cruelty. But neither did they allow any form of independence or self-determination. A soft chime echoed through the ship's speakers, followed by the mechanical voice of the translation system. Attention human cargo. Prepare for arrival at Kepler 442b. Report to designated assembly areas for work assignment processing. Sarah watched as people began gathering their belongings with the practiced efficiency of those who had learned not to question orders. 3 months in space had taught them all the value of compliance. But she noticed something else too: the way certain individuals caught each other's eyes, the subtle hand signals that had developed among the maintenance crews, the quiet conversations that stopped whenever a Zephyrian guard passed by. Resistance. It was growing, slowly and carefully, but it was there. As the transport ship descended toward Kepler 442b, Sarah could see the planet's surface through the observation ports. Vast agricultural complexes stretched to the horizon, their geometric perfection a stark contrast to the organic chaos of Earth's farmlands. Massive harvesting machines, operated by various alien species, moved through the crops like metal insects. Another paradise lost, Dr. Webb muttered. But Sarah wasn't looking at the machines or the sterile farmlands. She was watching the humans who were already working in the fields below. Even from this distance, she could see that they moved with purpose, that they worked in organized groups, that they had maintained some semblance of community despite their circumstances. The ship touched down with barely a tremor, the Zephyrian anti-gravity technology making the landing smoother than any human pilot could have achieved. Through the hull, they could hear the mechanical sounds of the docking process, the hiss of atmospheric equalizers, the distant voices of alien overseers preparing for another shipment of human workers. A Zephyrian guard entered their section, its crystalline skin flickering between blue and green, colors they had learned indicated routine administrative functions. It spoke in its own language, the words sounding like wind chimes in a gentle breeze, before the translation system converted its meaning: prepare for disembarkation. You will be processed in groups of 50. Compliance will be rewarded. Resistance will be corrected. Sarah stood and began organizing her section, but her mind was racing. The Zephyrians were powerful, technologically advanced, and seemingly invincible. But they had made one crucial mistake. They had underestimated humanity's greatest strength, not their capacity for violence or their technological ingenuity, but their ability to adapt, to survive, and to find hope in the darkest circumstances. As the first group of humans was led off the ship, Sarah caught sight of something that made her heart skip a beat. Carved into the metal wall near the exit, barely visible unless you knew where to look, were 3 letters: HTF, Human Task Force. Someone, somewhere, was organizing. The processing facility was a masterpiece of alien efficiency. Humans were sorted by age, physical capability, and skill set within minutes of leaving the ship. Sarah found herself assigned to agricultural supervision, while Dr. Webb was designated for biological research. They were separated without ceremony, but not before Webb pressed a small piece of metal into her hand. From the ship's hull, he whispered, "Some of us have been collecting materials. Just in case." The barracks they assigned Sarah were clean, functional, and utterly soulless. Rows of identical bunks filled a long, narrow building that housed 200 human workers. The only personal space each person had was a small locker at the foot of their bed. It was, Sarah realized, designed to break the human spirit through sheer monotony and loss of individuality. But, as she settled into her assigned bunk, she became aware of the subtle signs of resistance that Dr. Webb had noticed. Humans naturally formed small groups, sharing resources and information despite regulations against it. They had developed coded ways of communicating that the Zephyrian translation systems couldn't interpret. Most importantly, they remembered. They remembered Earth. They remembered freedom. They remembered what it felt like to make their own choices, even if those choices were sometimes wrong. That first night on Kepler 442b, Sarah lay awake listening to the sounds of her fellow humans, quiet conversations, muffled tears, whispered prayers in a dozen different languages. But, underneath it all, she heard something else, the sound of people planning, organizing, preparing. The next morning brought her first taste of agricultural supervision under alien rule. The farms were vast beyond human comprehension, stretching from horizon to horizon in perfectly ordered rows. The crops themselves were alien, tall, purple stalks that released a sweet, almost intoxicating aroma when disturbed. The harvesting machines moved through them with mechanical precision, but human workers were needed for quality control and maintenance. Sarah's role was to oversee a section of 100 human workers, ensuring they met their daily quotas while reporting any technical issues to the Zephyrian overseers. The work was backbreaking, the hours long, and the supervision constant. But it also provided something the Zephyrians hadn't counted on: opportunity. Working in the fields gave humans a chance to move around, to communicate with each other, to observe the alien technology up close. More importantly, it gave them access to materials: metal from broken machines, chemicals from the soil treatment systems, components from damaged communication arrays. Over the following weeks, Sarah began to understand the scope of the resistance movement that was growing among the human workers. It wasn't a traditional military organization; such a thing would have been impossible under constant alien surveillance. Instead, it was something more organic, more adaptable. Small cells of trusted individuals who gathered information, stockpiled resources, and maintained communication with other groups across the planet. They called themselves the Terran Underground, and their symbol was the simple 3-letter code that Sarah had seen carved into the transport ship: HTF, Human Task Force. It appeared in dozens of subtle forms throughout the work camp, scratched into metal surfaces, arranged in the pattern of discarded tools, even spelled out in the careful arrangement of stones along the walking paths. The Zephyrians, for all their technological sophistication, seemed oblivious to these signs. Their crystalline minds operated on principles of efficiency and logic that made them remarkably bad at recognizing the chaotic, emotional nature of human resistance. They saw compliance in the humans' ability to meet work quotas and follow basic rules, but they missed entirely the networks of loyalty, hope, and determination that were spreading through the camps like wildfire. 3 months into her time on Kepler 442b, Sarah was approached by a woman named Elena Vasquez, a former aerospace engineer who now worked in the Communication Relay Maintenance Division. They met during the brief rest period allowed after the midday meal, sitting on opposite ends of a bench while pretending to enjoy the artificial sunlight that the climate control systems provided. "We've made contact," Elena said quietly, her lips barely moving as she spoke. "There are 17 other agricultural worlds with human populations. Mining colonies in 4 different star systems. Even some humans working in the Zephyrian shipyards." Sarah felt her pulse quicken, but she kept her expression neutral. "How many? Conservative estimates? Over 2 million humans scattered across their empire. Most don't even know about the others yet, but word is spreading." Elena paused, glancing around to make sure no guards were within earshot. "There's something else. The ship maintenance crews have been analyzing Zephyrian technology. Their systems are incredibly advanced, but they're also standardized across their entire empire." "Meaning?" "Meaning they have central control nodes. Weak points. If we could coordinate a simultaneous action across multiple worlds." Elena trailed off, letting the implications speak for themselves. That night, Sarah stared up at the alien stars visible through the barracks' transparent roof. Somewhere out there were other humans, other groups like theirs, all working toward the same impossible goal: freedom. The odds against them were astronomical. The Zephyrians had technology that seemed like magic, resources that spanned dozens of worlds, and military forces that had conquered half the galaxy. But they had also made the fundamental mistake of underestimating their enemy. They saw humans as simple biological machines, capable of following orders and performing basic tasks, but lacking the intelligence or will to pose any real threat. They had no concept of human ingenuity born from desperation, or the way humans could find strength in their connections to each other. As Sarah finally drifted off to sleep, she thought about Dr. Webb's question from the transport ship: would future generations even remember what it was like to be free? She was determined to make sure they would have the chance to find out. The foundation of humanity's reckoning had been laid, not in the shipyards or research facilities of Earth, but in the agricultural fields and mining tunnels where humans learned to survive, to adapt, and to plan for the day when they would remind the galaxy why their species had once dreamed of reaching the stars. 18 months had passed since Sarah Chen first set foot on Kepler 442b, and the agricultural world had become a different place entirely. On the surface, nothing appeared to have changed. The same geometric crop patterns stretched to the horizon, the same harvesting machines moved through the fields with mechanical precision, and the same Zephyrian overseers maintained their cold efficiency. But underneath this facade of compliance, a revolution was quietly taking shape. Marcus Okafor wiped the sweat from his forehead as he completed another circuit inspection in the mining tunnels of asteroid station Gamma 7. The work was dangerous and exhausting, but it had given him something invaluable: an intimate understanding of Zephyrian industrial systems. Every circuit he repaired, every power conduit he maintained, every communication relay he tested added another piece to the growing puzzle of alien technology. "Another power fluctuation in Section D," announced his partner, a former electrical engineer named Lu Wei. They spoke in Mandarin, one of several Earth languages the Zephyrian translation systems had never bothered to learn. "Third one this week." Marcus nodded, making a note on his work tablet. But the notation he made wasn't about power fluctuations, it was a coded message that would be passed along through the hidden networks that now connected human workers across the asteroid belt. The power fluctuations were actually successful tests of jury-rigged communication devices, built from salvaged components and hidden in the maze of maintenance tunnels. The resistance had evolved far beyond the simple survival networks of its early days. What had begun as informal groups sharing resources and information had transformed into a sophisticated underground organization with cells on dozens of worlds. They had learned to think like the Zephyrians, in terms of systems and efficiency, while retaining the human capacity for innovation and adaptation. Elena Vasquez had become one of the key coordinators of what they now called the Terran Liberation Network. Her background in aerospace engineering had made her invaluable in understanding the alien technology that surrounded them, but her real gift was in organizing people. She had spent months identifying individuals with specific skills, building trust networks, and establishing communication protocols that could operate under constant surveillance. Her current assignment was perhaps the most ambitious yet, infiltrating the Zephyrian data networks. The opportunity had come when a communication array on Kepler 442b suffered what appeared to be a routine malfunction. Elena and her maintenance team were called in to repair it, giving them access to core systems that were normally completely isolated from human contact. What the Zephyrians didn't realize was that Elena had been preparing for this moment for over a year. Hidden in her toolkit, disguised as standard repair components, were devices that Marcus and teams like his had been building in secret across the Empire. They looked like ordinary circuit boards and power cells, but they contained something that would have terrified the Zephyrians if they had known it existed: a computer virus designed specifically to infiltrate their networks. The virus was a masterpiece of human ingenuity born from desperation. Traditional computer programming was useless against Zephyrian systems, which operated on quantum principles that human science barely understood. But the virus didn't try to understand those principles; instead, it mimicked them, learning and adapting as it spread through the network like a digital parasite. Upload complete, Elena whispered to her assistant as she sealed the access panel. The virus was now loose in the communication array, ready to begin its work of gathering intelligence and establishing covert communication channels. Meanwhile, on the industrial world of Procyon 4, Dr. Webb was discovering that his assignment to biological research had provided him with perhaps the most crucial intelligence of all. The Zephyrians had tasked him with studying human physiology to optimize work efficiency, but his real focus was on understanding their captors themselves. The Zephyrians, he had learned, were not the invincible conquerors they appeared to be. Their crystalline biology made them incredibly long-lived and resistant to most forms of physical damage, but it also made them inflexible. They thought in patterns that had been established millions of years ago, following protocols and procedures with religious devotion. Change, adaptation, and innovation were foreign concepts to them. More importantly, their empire was built on a foundation of subjugated species, each providing specific services that the Zephyrians themselves could not or would not perform. Humans were just the latest addition to a collection of slave races that included gas-breathing methane processors, silicon-based miners, and energy-manipulating technicians from a dozen different worlds. But none of these other species had ever organized effective resistance. They had accepted their roles, adapted to their circumstances, and found ways to survive within the system rather than challenging it. The Zephyrians had no experience dealing with a species that refused to accept its assigned place in the universal order. Webb's research had also revealed a critical weakness in the Zephyrian command structure. Their empire was vast, spanning hundreds of worlds and countless systems, but it was controlled by a relatively small number of command nodes. Each node was responsible for dozens of worlds, coordinating everything from resource allocation to population management. If those nodes could be disrupted simultaneously. The thought was almost too ambitious to consider, but Webb couldn't shake it. He began carefully documenting everything he learned about Zephyrian command protocols, disguising his notes as research data on human metabolic efficiency. Every scrap of information was memorized, encoded, and passed along through the growing network of human collaborators. On the shipbuilding world of Vega 3, former NASA engineer David Kim was making discoveries of his own. Assigned to maintenance work on Zephyrian transport vessels, he had gained access to the navigation and propulsion systems that held their empire together. The ships were marvels of engineering, capable of crossing vast distances through what the aliens called fold space, a technology that bent the fabric of reality itself. But Kim noticed something that the Zephyrians' rigid thinking had prevented them from seeing: their own technology was becoming predictable. Every ship followed the same design principles, used the same navigation protocols, and relied on the same central routing systems. It was efficient, but it was also vulnerable. Working with a team of human technicians, Kim began mapping the shipping routes that connected the Zephyrian Empire. They discovered that certain key systems served as hub points for dozens of others. If those systems were disrupted, it would create chaos across entire sectors. More importantly, they learned that all navigation data was updated from central servers on a predictable schedule. The implications were staggering. If they could coordinate their actions across multiple worlds, if they could strike at the right moment, if they could turn the Zephyrians' own efficiency against them. These discoveries were being shared across the human resistance through a network that would have seemed impossible just months earlier. The virus Elena had introduced into the communication systems was spreading from world to world, creating hidden channels that the Zephyrians couldn't detect. Messages were disguised as routine maintenance reports, supply requests, and work schedules. Complex plans were encoded in seemingly random data fluctuations. The network, as it had come to be known, now connected over 50 different worlds and installations. Farmers on agricultural worlds shared intelligence with miners in the asteroid belts. Technicians working on Zephyrian ships coordinated with maintenance crews in industrial complexes. Research facilities exchanged data with transportation hubs. Sarah Chen, now recognized as one of the senior coordinators on Kepler 442b, received regular reports from across the Empire. The scope of what they were planning grew larger with each passing day. What had begun as a simple dream of freedom was becoming something far more ambitious, a coordinated uprising that would strike at the heart of the Zephyrian Empire itself. But it was also becoming more dangerous. The Zephyrians were not completely blind to the changes happening around them. Work efficiency was declining in subtle ways across multiple worlds. Equipment failures were becoming more common. Communication systems were experiencing unexplained glitches. Most concerning of all, humans were beginning to act differently. They were still meeting their quotas, still following orders, still maintaining the appearance of compliance. But there was something in their movements, their posture, their interactions with each other that suggested a growing confidence. They no longer moved like defeated slaves, they moved like people with a purpose. On the command world of Zephyr Prime, Central Coordinator THYSS Connor was reviewing efficiency reports from across the Empire. The crystalline being's skin shifted to deep purple, the color of concern, as it processed the data. Human productivity had declined by 2.7% across all sectors over the past 6 months. Equipment maintenance requirements had increased by 4.1%. Communication traffic had risen by 8.6%, mostly consisting of routine reports that seemed to contain more data than necessary. Individually, these changes were within acceptable parameters. But, taken together, they suggested something that THYSS Connor found deeply disturbing: the humans were exhibiting signs of organizational behavior. The coordinator's first instinct was to increase surveillance and tighten control protocols. But doing so would require significant resources and might disrupt the productivity that made humans so valuable. The logical solution was to implement selective corrections, remove the most problematic individuals and increase efficiency incentives for the rest. But THYSS Connor had been studying humans for over 3 years, and something about their behavior patterns was troubling. Unlike other subject species, humans seemed to become more resistant to control measures over time, not less. Increased surveillance had led to more sophisticated concealment methods. Tighter control protocols had resulted in new forms of passive resistance. It was almost as if the humans were learning, adapting, evolving their resistance in response to countermeasures. Such behavior was unprecedented in the Zephyrian Empire. The coordinator made a decision that would prove to be crucial. Rather than implementing broad corrective measures, it would conduct a detailed analysis of human behavior patterns to understand exactly what was happening. The study would take months to complete, but it would provide the data necessary to design more effective control methods. It was a logical decision, based on sound principles of efficiency and thorough analysis. It was also exactly what the humans needed: time to complete their preparations. Across the Empire, human resistance cells received word through their hidden networks that they had been granted an unexpected reprieve. The Zephyrians were studying them, not acting against them. It was an opportunity that might not come again. Sarah Chen stood in the agricultural fields of Kepler 442b, watching the alien stars wheel overhead. Somewhere out there, millions of her fellow humans were working toward the same impossible goal. They had built a network that spanned dozens of worlds, created weapons from salvaged technology, and learned to think like a galactic civilization while retaining their humanity. The Zephyrians had wanted slaves. Instead, they had created an army. Soon, it would be time to show them the difference. The countdown had begun. Across 73 worlds and installations throughout the Zephyrian Empire, human resistance cells checked their equipment one final time. Hidden weapons constructed from salvaged materials were moved into position. Communication devices built from alien technology were tested and retested. Most importantly, the virus that had been quietly spreading through Zephyrian networks for over a year was ready to activate its final protocol. Sarah Chen stood in the center of the agricultural processing facility on Kepler 442b, her eyes fixed on the chronometer she had carved into the metal wall beside her workstation. The numbers had been calculated precisely, accounting for the time delays inherent in faster-than-light communication and the need for simultaneous action across dozens of star systems. When the final digit reached 0, humanity would either win its freedom or face total extinction. There would be no second chance. The plan they had developed was audacious in its scope and terrifying in its complexity. Unlike the focus strikes that traditional military thinking might have suggested, the human resistance had chosen to attack the very foundation of Zephyrian civilization, their absolute dependence on systematic efficiency and centralized control. Dr. Marcus Webb had identified the key vulnerability months earlier. The Zephyrians controlled their vast empire through a network of command nodes that processed information from hundreds of worlds and coordinated everything from resource allocation to population management. These nodes were heavily defended and considered impregnable by conventional military standards. But they had one critical weakness: they were designed to process vast amounts of routine data from trusted sources. The virus that Elena Vasquez had introduced into the communication networks wasn't designed to destroy the command nodes. Instead, it was designed to overwhelm them with false data, contradictory orders, and recursive logic loops that would cause them to effectively shut down trying to process impossible information. It was like feeding a supercomputer a paradox and watching it crash. But the virus was only the first phase of the plan. While the command nodes struggled to process the flood of false information, human teams across the empire would simultaneously strike at critical infrastructure points. David Kim's mapping of the transportation network had revealed that 17 key systems served as routing hubs for nearly half of all Zephyrian shipping. If those systems could be disrupted at the same moment the command nodes were compromised, it would create a cascade failure that would cripple the Empire's ability to coordinate a response. The timing had to be perfect. Too early, and the Zephyrians would adapt their systems and crush the rebellion before it could gain momentum. Too late, and they would detect the virus and implement countermeasures. There was a window of approximately 17 minutes during which the entire empire would be vulnerable, and humanity would have only one chance to strike. Marcus Okafor felt his hands trembling as he made the final adjustments to the improvised explosive device hidden in the main power coupling of Asteroid Station Gamma 7. Around him, his fellow miners had taken positions throughout the facility, each carrying their own crude but effective weapons. They had been preparing for this moment for months, but now that it had arrived, the magnitude of what they were attempting felt overwhelming. "Remember," Lu Wei whispered from his position near the communication array, "we're not just fighting for ourselves. We're fighting for every human who ever dreamed of touching the stars." The reminder helped steady Marcus's nerves. This wasn't just about survival anymore, it was about proving that humanity deserved its place among the civilizations of the galaxy, not as slaves but as equals. On Procyon 4, Dr. Webb was making his own final preparations. His assignment to biological research had given him access to the medical facilities where injured Zephyrians were treated. More importantly, it had taught him about their physiology and the specific frequencies of sound and light that could disrupt their crystalline nervous systems. The devices he and his team had built were essentially sophisticated strobe lights and sonic disruptors, calibrated to the exact frequencies that would cause temporary paralysis in Zephyrian biology. They wouldn't kill their captors. Humans had learned that the aliens were capable of recovering from almost any physical damage given enough time. But they would disable them long enough for the human workers to seize control of critical systems. Elena Vasquez was positioned at the central communication hub on Kepler 442b, her fingers hovering over the activation sequence that would trigger the virus's final phase. Around her, technicians who had spent months learning to mimic the aliens' maintenance procedures were ready to take control of the planet's defense systems. If everything went according to plan, they would be able to turn the Zephyrians' own weapons against their ships and installations. But Elena knew that even if everything went perfectly, they would still be facing impossible odds. The Zephyrians had thousands of ships, advanced weapons that could destroy entire planets, and the resources of a galactic empire. Humanity had improvised weapons, jury-rigged equipment, and the desperation of people who had nothing left to lose. It would have to be enough. The final seconds ticked away. Across the Empire, humans held their breath and waited for the signal that would either begin their liberation or ensure their annihilation. Children who had been born into slavery and elderly people who remembered Earth gathered in hidden shelters, knowing that their fate would be decided in the next few minutes. Engineers and farmers, doctors and miners, people from every nation and culture that had once called Earth home, all united in a single desperate gambit. The chronometer reached 0. On Zephyr Prime, Central Coordinator HFY Connor was reviewing the latest efficiency reports when its primary data console began displaying impossible information. According to the readings, 17 different agricultural worlds were simultaneously reporting crop yields that exceeded their planetary capacity by several orders of magnitude. Mining stations were claiming to extract resources from asteroids that didn't exist. Transportation hubs were logging arrivals from ships that were supposedly on the other side of the galaxy. The coordinator's skin shifted to rapid, chaotic patterns of color as it attempted to process the contradictory data. Its first assumption was system malfunction, but diagnostic routines showed all equipment functioning normally. The second possibility was coordinated data corruption, but the probability calculations for such an event were astronomically low. As HFY Connor struggled to understand what was happening, similar scenes were playing out at command nodes throughout the Empire. Coordinators found themselves buried under avalanches of impossible data, their logical thought processes grinding to a halt as they tried to reconcile information that violated the fundamental laws of physics and mathematics. The virus had done its work. For the first time in their civilization's history, the Zephyrians were experiencing something their rigid minds were utterly unprepared for: chaos. On Kepler 442b, Sarah Chen felt the ground beneath her feet vibrate as the improvised explosives hidden throughout the processing facility detonated simultaneously. The blasts had been carefully calculated to disable critical systems without causing structural collapse, but the sound was still deafening. Around her, human workers who had been pretending to perform routine tasks for months suddenly revealed weapons and moved with military precision toward predetermined targets. The Zephyrian guards, caught completely off guard, activated their emergency communication systems only to discover that the networks were completely overwhelmed with conflicting information. Their requests for reinforcements were lost in the chaos, their attempts to coordinate a response hampered by systems that were reporting impossible data from every corner of the Empire. Elena triggered the sonic disruptors, and the guards collapsed as their crystalline nervous systems overloaded. Within minutes, the humans had control of the facility's defense systems, communication arrays, and transportation hubs. Similar scenes were playing out across dozens of worlds. On Vega 3, David Kim's team seized control of 3 Zephyrian shipyards and began turning their automated defenses against the alien vessels attempting to land reinforcements. On Asteroid Station Gamma 7, Marcus Okafor and his miners captured the entire mining operation and used its heavy industrial equipment to destroy communication relays throughout the system. But perhaps the most significant victory came on Procyon 4, where Dr. Webb's team managed to capture the biological research facility and access its central databases. For the first time, humans gained detailed information about the full scope of the Zephyrian Empire, its structure, its weaknesses, and, most importantly, the locations of other subject species who might be willing to join their rebellion. The Zephyrians were not just slavers, they were the apex predators of a galactic ecosystem built on subjugation and exploitation. Dozens of intelligent species served them in various capacities, most having long ago abandoned any hope of freedom. But the human uprising was sending shockwaves throughout that carefully ordered system. On the methane processing world of Titan Analog 7, the Vrex workers received word of the human rebellion through hijacked communication channels. For the first time in 3 generations, they began to remember what their ancestors had been like before the conquest. Similar stirrings were reported among the silicon-based miners of the Kepler system and the energy manipulators of the Centauri colonies. The virus was spreading beyond computer networks into something far more dangerous, the idea that resistance was possible. But the Zephyrians were not helpless. As the initial chaos began to subside, backup command systems came online and began coordinating a response. Military vessels that had been patrolling the outer edges of the Empire received emergency orders to converge on the affected systems. Automated defense platforms that had been dormant for centuries awakened and began targeting human settlements. The real war was just beginning. On Zephyr Prime, THYSS Connor finally managed to isolate and analyze the source of the data corruption. The discovery that a primitive computer virus had been responsible for crippling their entire command network should have been humiliating, but the coordinator felt something far more disturbing: respect. The humans had not simply rebelled, they had demonstrated strategic thinking on a galactic scale. They had studied their captors' weaknesses, built a resistance network that spanned dozens of star systems, and executed a coordinated attack that had caught the most advanced civilization in the galaxy completely unprepared. For the first time in its existence, THYSS Connor understood that it was facing an enemy that might actually be capable of winning. The coordinator activated emergency protocols that had not been used in over 1,000,000 years, mobilizing the full military might of the Zephyrian Empire. Every available ship was dispatched to retake the rebellious worlds. Weapons platforms capable of cracking planets were brought out of storage and prepared for deployment. The order went out across the Empire: the human rebellion would be crushed with such overwhelming force that no other species would ever dare to follow their example. But, as the Zephyrian fleets began their convergence on human-held territories, they discovered that their enemies had spent their brief window of opportunity well. The captured shipyards were producing new vessels designed with hybrid human-Zephyrian technology. The mining facilities were converting their industrial equipment into massive weapons platforms. Most disturbing of all, the humans had begun broadcasting their rebellion to other subject species across the galaxy. The virus had evolved beyond its original programming, becoming something that no computer system could contain, a viral idea that freedom was possible, spreading from world to world and species to species. Sarah Chen stood on the observation deck of the captured facility on Kepler 442b, watching as Zephyrian ships appeared in the system's outer reaches. The alien fleet was massive, easily capable of reducing the planet to rubble within hours. But she was no longer the defeated refugee who had arrived on a transport ship 2 years ago. She was a general in humanity's war for survival, and she had learned to think like her enemies. The Zephyrians were coming to retake their territory, but they were also walking into a trap. The humans had spent months studying their tactics, their technology, and their weaknesses. More importantly, they had allies now, other species who had finally found the courage to stand up to their oppressors. The battle for Kepler 442b would determine the fate of not just humanity, but every enslaved species in the galaxy. As the Zephyrian fleet began its approach, Sarah activated the communication system that would broadcast her message throughout the Empire. "This is Sarah Chen of the Terran Liberation Network, speaking for the free humans of Kepler 442b. For 3 years, you have treated us as property. You have scattered us across the galaxy, forced us to build your empire, and tried to break our spirits. But you made one critical mistake: you underestimated the species that once dreamed of touching the stars." She paused, watching as more human ships emerged from hiding positions throughout the system. They were cobbled together from alien technology and human ingenuity, crewed by people who had learned to fight with the desperation of those who had nothing left to lose. "You wanted slaves," Sarah continued, her voice carrying to every world in the Empire. "Instead, you created soldiers. You wanted obedience. Instead, you inspired revolution. You thought you were conquering humanity. Instead, you taught us to become something we never could have achieved alone, united." The Zephyrian fleet was within weapons range now, their massive ships bristling with weapons that could annihilate entire civilizations. But they were facing something they had never encountered before, an enemy that had learned to think like them while retaining the chaotic adaptability that made humans so dangerous. Today, the age of Zephyrian dominance ends, Sarah declared. Today, the galaxy learns what happens when you try to cage the species that once looked up at the night sky and decided it wasn't enough to wonder what was out there, we had to go and see for ourselves. The first shots of the Galactic War erupted across the Kepler 442b system, but the outcome had already been determined. The Zephyrians had created their own reckoning, and humanity was ready to collect what was owed.